Hello everyone and welcome to the Game Engine programming series where we write a game engine from scratch. Previously we worked on the back end of import settings configuration for textures. Today we are going to add the user interface that will let us assemble multiple images in order to create texture arrays and 3D textures. In the last video, we added a new user control for texture import settings configuration. Now, instead of building up the UI from scratch, we can reuse a lot of what we already made for geometry because of its similarity. Therefore, I'm going to copy the entire content of Configure Geometry Import Settings view over to our new control. Start by renaming the user control class and work our way down the code to see what we need to change. Obviously, we have the geometry import settings control here, which we have to replace eventually, but let's start at the top. I think almost all user control resources can stay the same, so I'll leave them as is. Looking at the content of the first panel, where we have the import button and the list of proxies, we only have to replace all references to geometry by texture. This is because we have the same class structure as you can see here. So the data context is texture import settings configurator, and we bind the list of texture proxies, which is going to be displayed on the left panel in the list box. As I mentioned in the last video, a texture can be constructed from one or more images, and I'd like to display the list of image files that will be used together. Therefore, I'll add an extra row and column to list box items. If the texture consists of multiple images, a green border will appear on the left side of that list box item. Again, we can use a data trigger to determine the visibility of the green border. Next to the border, we display an expander that contains the list of image sources for the texture. Obviously, the expander should also be visible only when the texture has multiple image sources. We use an items control and bind it to the list of image sources in order to display the file name of each image. I'll use the orange brush for displaying the file names. Of course, feel free to use any color and layout as you please. We need to shift the remove button by one column since we added the extra column for the green border. We also have to rename the controls accordingly. Here I'm replacing all references to geometry list box by texture list box. That's all for the first panel. I'm going to comment out the rest of the user control so we can test what we have made so far. Before being able to run the editor, we have to implement a few event handlers. Fortunately, we can also copy these from Configure Geometry Import Settings view. Here I just find and replace the word geometry with the word texture. Clearing importing items is simpler since we only have to remove texture assets. Also, similar to geometry, we want to give the list box focus as soon as the control is loaded, so we can also copy this part. Now we can run the editor, but I forgot to add the new control, which I can still do while the editor is running. Here we can see the list of images. I can even press the import button to import an image using the default import settings. We can't test the multiple image textures yet, so let's work on that part next. Let me uncomment the SAML code again. Okay, here we'll work on the second panel in the middle. Again, change references to texture proxies. And I'll add an extra row for the list of image sources. We'll create the control for texture import settings in the next video, so for now I'll again use the Tinky Winky placeholder. The rest of it can stay the same, I think. First, I'm going to add the part where we can assemble multiple image files for the texture. Oh, this should be in the 5th row of the grid. Okay, so this part consists of a few buttons on the right side and a list box on the left for image sources. Let me make the control bigger so we have more real estate to work on. As I mentioned, the left side has a few buttons for adding, removing, and reordering of source images. The first button will move selected texture proxies into the list of image sources. This button is only enabled when multiple texture proxies are selected in the left panel. I'm going to create a little arrow for the button to indicate the direction in which items are moved between the two list boxes. This should display the arrow. However, in order to see it, we should define a local style for the path controls used for the arrow shapes. It's a simple style that sets the margin and the fill color of the path depending on whether it is enabled or not. Now we can see the arrow. The next button moves the selected image sources back into the list of texture proxies in the left panel. Now we have two left arrows, which isn't right, so the top arrow should be right. But it isn't right now, right? So let's make it right. Okay, great. Let's add two more buttons for reordering selected image sources. We could also use drag and drop for all of this, but that's more work than it's worth for this less frequently used functionality. So we are just going to use repeat buttons. The difference between a repeat button and a regular button is that a repeat button keeps firing click events for as long as the user is pressing it, whereas the regular button raises a single click event. Fortunately, we can still use the primal button style. I forgot to mention that the button for removing image sources is only enabled if there is at least one image source selected. I'll add the list box for this in a minute. Similarly, the reordering buttons are only enabled if at least one item is selected. Since they move the items up and down the list, I'll make the arrows point up and down as well. Next is the list box for image sources. This is similar to the list box in the left panel. We can use the same alternating colors item style as we did for the list of proxies. However, the item template is different, since in this case, the items shouldn't have the expander and the green border. Therefore, I'm going to add a separate item template in the user-controlled resources. Like I said, it's the same as proxy items, but without the expander. So I can copy and paste this part. And now we can use it for image sources. That's the UI control part. Now we only have to write these 4 event handlers. For adding image sources, we get the target proxy, which is the data context of this control, and we get the list of selected items in texture list box. Then we call moveToTarget method of texture import settings configurator to move each proxy in the selected folder to the list of image sources. Before doing so, we need to copy the list of selected items so that we don't modify the original collection of selected items. To remove image sources and put them back into the proxy list, we have to get the selected items from image source list box and call moveFromTarget. Oops, this should be moveToTarget. Move up and move down methods are so similar that I'm going to use a third method which we can call for both of them using slightly different parameters. In both cases, we copy the selected items and then call the provided action. The action is a call to move up and move down methods respectively. We could have done this for the previous 2 methods as well, which I'll leave as an exercise. Okay, now we are ready to test image sources. However, before I forget, we have to remove this line of code in the texture asset class, which we used before we had the import settings configuration module. Let's try and group a few textures together. Here we see that the selection is added to the list of image sources. The green bar isn't placed correctly, which can be fixed easily. We can also see a list of images in the expander. When we reorder the items, it will also reflect the changes. And we can also move the image sources back into the list of proxies. And to fix the green bar position, we have to shift everything else by 1 column to the right. Now it looks better. One more thing is that I'd like to not take the focus away from the list boxes when we use these buttons. We can set the focusable property of the buttons to false so that the focus doesn't move. The downside is that now we can't interact with the buttons using a keyboard. However, I'm not particularly focused on making the editor to be usable without a mouse anyway, so I guess it should be fine. Okay, we can also see that we can't remove the last image source, which is the proxy itself. So that's working as intended. Let me fix a couple of typos and I think we can wrap it up for today. So today we made all of this new functionality that we can use to combine images from which we can create texture arrays and 3D textures, and we can put them in any order that we want. Although I'm not sure if it's entirely bug-free since it appears to flip the selected image sources. I'll have to examine that more closely to see what's exactly happening, but for now it's good enough. Okay, that's all for today. Next time we are going to add a new control for texture import settings, similar to the one we made for the geometry. As always, thank you for joining me and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. If you join me on Patreon, you'll get access to the code on GitHub so you don't have to type everything over from the video. Plus there are also other nice goodies and rewards exclusive to my Patreon supporters. Please use the link in the video description to check them out. I hope to see you next time. Until then, take care and happy game engineering!